Silverio was a quiet man of few words and a distant look, almost always hunched over his work at the Cemetery of Angels. He had taken on the role of gravedigger when he was still young after inheriting the position from his uncle who had worked there for more than 3 decades. The cemetery was in an isolated part of the city on a hillside covered in dry trees that were even more threatening in the fall when the dead leaves fell and covered the graves with a silent and melancholic layer. They say that to be a gravedigger you need more than courage, you need a certain type of temperament, an acceptance of the silence that surrounds the work, and Silverio seemed to have been born for it, because he showed no fear as he walked among the graves. However, there was one specific part of the cemetery that even he didn't like to approach, a forgotten area full of moss-covered tombstones with dates so old that many had already become illegible. One day, while doing maintenance on some tombstones near the forgotten area, Silverio found a curious object. When he moved the tall grass away, he noticed the shine of a medallion stuck between the roots. The object looked like an old one, made of silver darkened by time, with a small mirror in the center covered in cracks. He felt an inexplicable chill when he touched it, but he put the medallion in his pocket, thinking that it could be an item lost by a relative on one of their rare visits. That night, when he returned home, the gravedigger noticed something strange. When he held the medallion, he could swear he heard voices of distant muffled murmurs, as if the object held echoes from the past. He tried to ignore it, attributing it to fatigue, but the whispers seemed to get louder until he could no longer bear it. He put the medallion inside a drawer, determined to return it to the cemetery the next morning. However, at dawn, he found the drawer open and the medallion on the table, as if someone had taken it. Intrigued and a little scared, he decided to take the object back and bury it where he had found it. Back at the cemetery, Silverio dug a small grave to bury the medallion, but when he removed the first layer of soil, he found a wooden box buried there. The object seemed as old as the cemetery itself, with the edges crumbling to the touch. He carefully opened it and found inside a set of letters and notes that seemed to relate an old mystery. The letters were from a woman named Beatrice, who had apparently worked at the cemetery as a caretaker decades ago. In the notes, she spoke of a series of strange disappearances, bodies that had been buried but mysteriously disappeared from the graves the next morning. Beatrice mentioned that she heard footsteps during the early hours of the morning and saw shadows among the graves, but whenever she tried to investigate, she found nothing. That night, Silverio took only a flashlight and a shovel. Trying to stay calm as he observed the cemetery in complete silence, the wind seemed stronger, making the dry trees sway and creating shadows that moved across the ground. He positioned himself near the area where he had found him and waited as the hours dragged by in an almost oppressive silence. Shortly after midnight, he heard soft footsteps behind a row of graves. The flashlight trembled in his hands as he pointed the beam of light in the direction of the sound. What he saw made him involuntarily step back. A tall, hunched figure in dirty, worn clothes was stirring the dirt of a recent grave upon noticing Silverio's presence. The figure raised its head and he could see a pale face with deep, expressionless eyes, as if life had long since faded from there. The figure made no move to run away, but just continued to stare at him, until with frightening slowness, he opened his mouth and murmured in a hoarse and almost inaudible voice, "They do not rest and they will never rest." Silverio tried to scream, but his voice failed. He watched helplessly as the figure disappeared among the tombstones, leaving only the sound of distant footsteps that soon merged into silence. The next morning, still in shock, Silverio decided to investigate the cemetery records for any clues about the disappearances mentioned in Beatrice's letters. After hours of searching, he found a recurring name in the old records: Artur del Muro, a former caretaker who had worked at the cemetery before his aunt and who had curiously disappeared without a trace. They said that Artur had gone crazy before disappearing, talking about voices and figures that no one else could see. Silverio realized that the mystery was older than he had imagined, involving generations of cemetery workers. He then decided to seek help and took the case to a local historian, who told him about an old legend involving the cemetery. It was said that in the 19th century a group of people were buried there without proper rites after being accused of heresy. Legend has it that these forgotten people never found peace and that with each generation someone was drawn to the cemetery to take care of them. Silverio felt an inexplicable weight as if he were trapped in that place, condemned to take care of something he could not fully understand. He tried to move away from the cemetery and asked to be transferred, but strangely his request was denied as if an invisible force wanted to keep him there. Silverio continued to work in the cemetery for a few more years, but his mental health began to deteriorate. He began to mumble to himself, always worried about watching over the forgotten area. Visitors would often find him talking to the tombstones as if he were having a silent conversation with the forgotten. Until one morning, the new gravedigger who would take his place found Silverio's notebook left open on the table. On the last pages there was a brief but disturbing note. "I see them every night, they will never rest, and now I know that not even I am trapped in this place, just like the others before me. May God have mercy on my soul, for I no longer possess it." Silverio disappeared that same night, and no one ever saw him again. The cemetery of the angels remained there unchanged, except for the feeling that something ancient and dark still haunted the tombs. For more stories like this, follow the channel Hunter of Darkness. Don't forget to like and leave your comment.